The Valari had conquered 347 species across 9 galaxies. They had never failed. Not once in 12,000 years of expansion. Their method was simple and perfect. They used mathematics. Every species in the universe, no matter how strange or advanced, followed patterns. Fear made them run. Hunger made them fight. Love made them protect their young. All of these things could be measured. All of them could be predicted. And all of them could be used. When the first Valari scout ship entered the Sol system, it was a routine mission. The ship's II scanned the third planet from the yellow star and began collecting data. It found a young species. They called themselves humans. They had existed for only 200,000 years, which was nothing in galactic terms. They had primitive technology, basic fusion reactors, chemical rockets, simple computers. They had not even left their own solar system yet. The AI processed all the information it could find. It watched their broadcasts. It studied their history. It analyzed their wars, their governments, their religions, their art. After 17 hours of calculation, it produced a threat assessment report and sent it to the fleet. Admiral Kethora read the report in his command chamber aboard the flagship. He was old by Valari standards, having served the collective for over 600 years. He had personally overseen the conquest of 93 worlds. He had seen species beg for mercy. He had seen them fight with desperate courage. He had seen them try to bargain, to hide, to flee. In the end, they all submitted. Mathematics demanded it. The report on humanity was not impressive. The species was divided into competing nations. They fought among themselves constantly. Their weapons were laughably primitive compared to Valari technology. The AI calculated a 99.97% probability that humanity would surrender within 6 standard rotations after first contact. Kethora approved the invasion with barely a second thought. On Earth, it was a Tuesday morning when the first signals were detected. Lieutenant Yuna was working the night shift at the Pacific Defense Command in Seoul. She was 26 years old. She had joined the military 5 years ago, after her older brother died in the Jakarta flood. The disaster had killed 3 million people when the seawalls failed. Yuna had been in university at the time, studying music. She never went back to her classes. The signal came in at 3:47 a.m. local time. At first, Yuna thought it was a glitch. The pattern was too regular, too structured. It could not be natural. She ran the data through 3 different analysis programs. All of them agreed. The signal was artificial. It was coming from just beyond the orbit of Mars, and it was directed at Earth. Yuna felt her hands begin to shake. She had trained for this moment. Everyone in the Defense Force had. First contact protocols had existed for over a century, but no one actually expected to use them. She picked up the phone and called her commanding officer. Within an hour, the signal had been decoded. It was a message. The language was strange, but the meaning was clear. A species called the Valari claimed ownership of the Sol system. They demanded that humanity surrender immediately and unconditionally. Humans would become a servant species. Their planet would be harvested for resources. 60% of the population would be eliminated to reduce resource consumption. They had 72 hours to comply. General Donghyun arrived at the command center as the sun was rising over Seoul. He was 63 years old, with gray hair and deep lines on his face. He had served in 3 continental wars. He had watched cities burn. He had buried soldiers and friends and family. He was tired of war, but he had never stopped fighting. He read the message 5 times. Then he looked at the tactical display showing 17 massive vessels approaching Earth orbit. Each ship was larger than anything humanity had ever built. Each one could destroy a city in seconds. His aide, a young sergeant named Soman, stood beside him. She was trying to keep her face calm, but Do-yoon could see the fear in her eyes. "Sir," she said quietly, "what do we do?" Do-yoon was silent for a long moment. He thought about his daughter, who lived in Bizen with her husband and 2 children. He thought about his wife, who had died 10 years ago and never had to see this day. He thought about all the graves of all the soldiers who had fought and died for their home. "Get me the Security Council," he said. "All of them. Every nation. Every leader. Now." The meeting took place via secure holographic link. Faces appeared around Do-yoon's table. The American President, the Chinese Premier, the European Chancellor, the African Union Chair. Leaders from every corner of the world, all of them looking at the same data, all of them facing the same impossible choice. Some wanted to negotiate. Perhaps the aliens would accept a smaller reduction in population. Perhaps they would allow humans some measure of autonomy. Perhaps there was a deal to be made. Others wanted to fight. Yes, the odds were terrible. Yes, humanity would probably lose. But surrender meant extinction anyway, just slower. Some simply sat in silence, too shocked to speak. Do-yoon listened to all of them. He watched them argue and debate and plead. He watched them run the numbers over and over, trying to find an outcome that made sense. Finally, he spoke. "They are counting on us to do the math," he said. His voice was calm and steady. "They expect us to calculate our losses before we have even started fighting. They expect us to weigh our debt against our chances and decide that surrender is the logical choice." He looked around the table, meeting each leader's eyes. "They have conquered 300 species using that logic. And I am sure those species were wise. I am sure they were rational. I am sure they made the smart choice." He paused. "But we are not those species. We are human. And humans do not always make the smart choice. Sometimes we make the stubborn choice. The angry choice. The choice that makes no sense except that we refuse to kneel." The American president leaned forward. "General, you are talking about the extinction of our species. I am talking about dying on our feet instead of living on our knees," Do-yoon replied. "I am talking about making them pay for every city, every country, every life. I am talking about showing the universe that humanity does not submit, ever." He stood up from his chair. "They want an answer in 72 hours. I say we give them one right now. Tell them no. Tell them we would rather burn than bow. And then let us see how good their mathematics really are." The vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive. Humanity said no. In orbit, the Valari fleet received the response. Admiral Cathora read it with mild surprise. This was not the predicted outcome, but it was not unprecedented either. Some species resisted at first. They always changed their minds after the bombardment began. "Target their major population centers," he ordered. "Standard suppression protocol. They will surrender within 2 rotations." The ships moved into attack position. Their weapons powered up, glowing with energy that could vaporize mountains. Below, on Earth, people looked up at the sky. They knew what was coming. Many were praying. Many were crying. Many were holding their families close. But some of them were not afraid. Some of them were angry. And that anger would change everything. The Valari had calculated every possible outcome. They had predicted every response. They had prepared for every scenario. Except one. They had not prepared for a species that would rather die than submit. They had not prepared for rage without limit. They had not prepared for hatred that burned brighter than their weapons. They had not prepared for humanity. The first beam struck at exactly noon, Greenwich Mean Time. The Valari were precise in all things. They believed in efficiency. They believed in order. They believed that enough destruction would break any species. New York died first. The beam came down from the sky like the finger of an angry god. One moment, there was a city of 12 million people. The next moment, there was only light. White, blinding, terrible light. The buildings did not fall. They simply stopped existing. The people did not scream. There was no time. One heartbeat, they were alive. The next heartbeat, they were ash drifting on a wind that smelled of burning metal. Mumbai was next. Then Lagos, then Beijing. Then Cairo. Then Sao Paulo. City after city, each one a race from the world in seconds. The Volare worked methodically, moving from target to target with the calm patience of farmers harvesting wheat. Captain G1 was in Seoul when the beam came for her city. She was 34 years old. She had been born in Seoul, grown up in its streets, fallen in love for the first time in a small coffee shop near the Han River. Her parents still lived in the old neighborhood, in the same apartment where she had taken her first steps. She had been trying to reach them all morning, but the communication networks were overloaded with panic. When the sky turned white, she was leading a convoy of evacuation buses through the northern districts. She saw the beam descend. She saw her city disappear. And then the shock wave hit. The bus she was riding in flew through the air like a toy thrown by a child. It tumbled end over end for what felt like forever. When it finally stopped, Ji-won was lying in a ditch 300 meters from where she had started. Her left arm was shattered in 4 places. Her uniform had melted to her skin in patches. Blood was running into her eyes from a gash on her forehead. She lay there for a long time, staring at the sky. The clouds had turned orange and black. Ash was falling like snow. She could hear screaming in the distance, but it seemed very far away. Her parents were dead. She knew this without needing to check. The old neighborhood was gone. The coffee shop was gone. Everything she had ever loved about her city was gone. Something changed inside her in that moment. The Volare would later try to classify this change. They would call it psychological trauma. They would predict that it would make her less effective as a soldier. They would add her to their models as another broken human, ready to surrender. They were wrong. Ji-won stood up. Her arm hung useless at her side. Every breath sent fire through her chest. But she stood up anyway. And she started walking. She found survivors along the way. 17 soldiers from various units, all of them wounded, all of them lost. 43 civilians who had somehow lived through the shockwave. An old man named Byung-ho, who was 76 years old and had been a demolitions expert in the Korean Reunification War 60 years ago. They gathered in the ruins of a subway station, huddled together in the darkness while the world burned above them. Ji-won looked at their faces. She saw fear. She saw grief. She saw the same hollow shock that she felt in her own heart. But she also saw something else. She saw anger. Quiet, patient, absolute anger. The kind of anger that does not fade with time. The kind of anger that becomes a part of who you are. They think this is over, Ji-won said. Her voice was rough from smoke. They think we will give up now. They think destroying our cities will break us. She looked at Byung-ho. The old man met her eyes and nodded slowly. They have ships in orbit, Ji-won continued. They have weapons we cannot match. But they are going to land troops. They need workers to extract resources. They need bodies to serve them. And when their soldiers touch our soil, we are going to make them pay for every step they take. A young private named Yoonji raised her hand. She was 19 years old. She had been a university student yesterday. Today she was holding a rifle she barely knew how to use. How? Yoonji asked. We have nothing. They have everything. Byung-ho spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet, but everyone listened. I spent 40 years learning how to destroy things, he said. Bridges, buildings, bunkers. I know how things break. And I can teach you. He paused, looking at the darkness around them. We cannot win a war against them, but we can make this war cost them more than they ever imagined. We can make them bleed for every grain of our soil. Across the burning planet, similar conversations were happening. In the rubble of what had been Sydney, a group of firefighters were planning their first ambush. In the frozen wastes where Vancouver used to stand, a community of survivors was building weapons from the debris of their homes. In the irradiated ruins along the Nile, soldiers and civilians were coming together with one shared purpose. Humanity was not surrendering. Humanity was getting angry. Admiral Cathora received the first ground reports 3 days after the bombardment. His troops had landed at 12 strategic locations around the planet. They were equipped with the finest weapons in the galaxy. They had energy shields that could stop any projectile. They had armor that adapted to any threat. They had been trained to perfection. They were dying. The reports made no sense. Ground forces were encountering resistance at every location. Not organized military resistance. The Valari algorithms had accounted for that. This was something different. Something the models could not explain. Humans were attacking with farming equipment, with sharpened metal, with fire and acid and their bare hands. They were charging directly into plasma fire without slowing down. They were hiding in rubble and emerging to strike from behind. They were sacrificing their lives to kill single soldiers. In one report, a group of elderly humans had attacked an armored patrol with kitchen knives. They had all died. That they had killed 3 Valari soldiers before falling. In another report, a wounded human had crawled 200 meters with both legs destroyed, dragging a bomb behind her. She had detonated it beneath a supply vehicle, destroying herself and the vehicle and 6 Valari technicians. Cathora summoned his tactical analysts. "Explain this behavior," he demanded. The lead analyst studied the data for a long time. Finally, she spoke. "They are not fighting to win, Admiral. They are fighting to hurt us. They know they will die. They know it will not change the outcome. But they attack anyway. That is irrational." "Yes, Admiral. It is completely irrational. Our models cannot predict irrational behavior." Cathora felt something he had not felt in centuries. It took him a moment to recognize it. It was doubt. For the first time in his long career, he was not certain of victory. He pushed the feeling aside. Surely this was temporary. Surely the humans would tire. Surely their anger would fade, and they would accept the inevitable. But deep in his mind, a small voice whispered, "What if they do not? What if their anger never fades? What if they fight until every single one of them is dead?" He had no answer. His mathematics had no answer. And in the darkness of occupied Earth, humanity sharpened its knives and waited for the next patrol to pass. Dr. Minji had been a scientist before the invasion. She had spent 15 years studying alien life, always hoping that one day humanity would find proof that they were not alone in the universe. She had imagined that first contact would be beautiful. She had dreamed of sharing knowledge with beings from distant stars. She had believed that intelligence would recognize intelligence, that wisdom would meet wisdom across the void. She did not dream anymore. Now she worked in a bunker deep beneath the Swiss Alps. The facility had been built a century ago, designed to survive nuclear war. It had survived something worse. Around her, a team of exhausted scientists labored around the clock, studying every piece of Valari technology they could capture. General Doan appeared on her screen via encrypted satellite link. He looked 10 years older than he had before the invasion. He was operating from a mobile command center that moved every 12 hours, staying ahead of Valari hunter-killer drones. "Tell me you have something," he said. Minji nodded slowly. "I have something, but you will not like it." She pulled up a holographic display showing Valari weapon systems, energy shields, adaptive armor, targeting computers that could track a bullet in flight. "They are too advanced," she said. "We cannot match their technology. We cannot break their shields with our weapons. We cannot penetrate their armor with our bullets. Every system they have operates on predictive algorithms. They see our attacks before we make them." Diane's face did not change. "Then we have already lost." "No," Minji leaned forward. "We have not lost. Because their strength is also their weakness. Their algorithms predict rational behavior. They assume we will do what makes sense. They assume we will protect ourselves, conserve our resources, choose tactics that give us the best chance of survival." She paused. "But what if we stop making sense?" Major Taeyang was listening from another bunker, somewhere in what used to be Canada. He was 38 years old. He had been Special Forces before the invasion, one of the best soldiers in the Korean military. Now he commanded from a wheelchair. A Valari beam had taken both his legs 3 months ago. He had kept fighting from his stretcher while his soldiers carried him to safety. "You are talking about suicide tactics," he said. "Kamikaze runs. We are already doing that." "I am talking about more than that," Minji replied. "I am talking about complete randomness. Actions that have no strategic purpose at all. Attacks that make no military sense. We need to become unpredictable. Not just brave. Completely, absolutely unpredictable." She showed them the data she had gathered. The Valari AI processed human behavior constantly, looking for patterns. When it found patterns, it predicted human actions. When it predicted human actions, Valari soldiers knew where humans would be and what they would do. But when the AI could not find patterns, it hesitated. The hesitation was small, just fractions of a second. But in combat, fractions of a second meant everything. "We need to feed their computers garbage," Minji said. "We need to behave in ways that break their models. Retreat when we are winning. Attack when we are outnumbered. Strike worthless targets while ignoring valuable ones. Make them see patterns that do not exist." General Do-hyun was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke. "This will cost lives. Many lives. Soldiers will die for no reason except to confuse enemy computers." "Yes," Minji agreed. "But soldiers are already dying. At least this way, their deaths will mean something. Their sacrifice will create gaps in Valari defenses. Gaps we can exploit." The strategy spread across the resistance network. Within weeks, human forces were behaving in ways that defied every rule of warfare. They attacked supply depots full of worthless equipment while ignoring ammunition stores. They retreated from battles they were winning and charged into battles they could not survive. They did things that made no sense to anyone, including themselves. And it worked. In what remained of Tokyo, an old woman named Yoon-hee led a group of survivors in a night attack on a Valari patrol station. She was 72 years old. She had been a teacher before the invasion, spending 40 years helping children learn to read. Now she carried a bottle filled with homemade napalm in each hand. Her group had no real weapons. They had kitchen knives and sharpened pipes and fire. They had no training. Half of them had never held a weapon before the invasion. They also had no fear. They had lost everything. Their families were dead. Their city was ash. They had nothing left to protect, nothing left to save. All they had was rage. The Valari AI detected their approach and calculated the threat level. 73 elderly and untrained humans with primitive weapons against a fortified position with energy shields and plasma cannons. The probability of human success was calculated at 0.003%. The AI assigned lowest priority to the threat and continued monitoring other sectors. This was a mistake. Yanhee and her group did not attack the front gate. They did not try to penetrate the shields. Instead, they set fire to the buildings around the station. They burned everything within 200 meters, creating a wall of flame that disrupted Valari sensors. And while the soldiers inside were trying to figure out what was happening, Yanhee led a charge through the flames. She died 17 meters from the main entrance. A plasma bolt caught her in the chest, and she fell without a sound. But she had already thrown her napalm. The bottle shattered against a ventilation shaft, and fire poured into the station. 37 Valari soldiers died that night. The station was destroyed. The supply lines it protected were exposed. And on the Valari tactical network, an error message appeared that their commanders were learning to dread. Behavioral prediction failure. Subject displayed 0% self-preservation instinct. Admiral Cathora summoned his senior staff to a war council. The mood was grim. Casualty reports were arriving from every continent, every day. Soldiers were dying at rates that exceeded all projections. Morale was falling. Some units were refusing deployment orders. "Explain this," Cathora demanded. He displayed footage of the Tokyo attack. Old women running through fire. Children throwing rocks at armored vehicles. Wounded soldiers detonating explosives strapped to their own bodies. The lead analyst spoke slowly, choosing her words with care. "They are not operating within normal behavioral parameters, Admiral. They have abandoned all self-preservation instincts. They have decoupled their actions from any logical outcome. They are not trying to win. They are trying to hurt us, regardless of cost to themselves." "That is insane," Cathora said. "Yes, Admiral. And our systems cannot predict insanity. Every model we have assumes that living beings want to survive. Humans appear to have suspended that desire. They are willing to die not for victory, but simply for the satisfaction of causing us pain." Cathora stared at the footage for a long time. He watched an old woman burn. He watched children die. He watched soldiers keep fighting with wounds that should have killed them. "What do they want?" he asked quietly. The analyst hesitated. "They want us to suffer, Admiral. They want us to feel what they feel. They want us to understand what it means to lose everything." She paused. "And I do not believe they will stop until one of our species is extinct." The room was silent. For the first time in 12,000 years, the Valari collective faced an enemy they did not understand. And understanding, they were beginning to realize, was the foundation of everything they did. Without it, they were lost. 6 months after the first beam fell from the sky, the Valari controlled most of Earth's major resource sites. Their extraction operations were running at 70% efficiency. Their orbital platforms were processing minerals and shipping them back to the collective. By every standard measure, the conquest was succeeding. But the numbers told a different story. Valari casualties had exceeded all projections by a factor of 11. Every mining site required constant defense. Every supply convoy needed armed escort. Every patrol lost soldiers. The occupation that was supposed to require 12,000 troops now demanded over 200,000. And still the attacks continued. Lieutenant Hyungwoo had been tracking these numbers carefully. He was 31 years old, and before the invasion, he had been an accountant. Now, he led one of the most effective resistance cells in the Eastern Territories. He had no military training. He had simply discovered that he was very good at killing aliens. His cell operated from a network of tunnels beneath the ruins of Daegu. They had mapped every Valari patrol route, every supply schedule, every rotation change. They struck fast and disappeared before reinforcements could arrive. In 6 months, they had killed over 300 Valari soldiers. But Yamu had noticed something recently, something that might be more valuable than any ambush. He reported his observation to General Dohyun via encrypted message. "They are afraid," he said. "Not cautious, not careful, genuinely afraid. I have been questioning captured prisoners, and they keep asking the same thing. Why are we still fighting? They cannot understand it. They see our dead, and they assume we must be close to breaking. But we are not breaking, and that terrifies them." Dahyun processed this information carefully. He was operating from a new mobile headquarters now, somewhere in the Australian outback. He had not slept more than 3 hours at a time in months. His body was failing him slowly, but his mind remained sharp. They have never encountered a species like us, he realized. Their entire psychology is built on calculation. They weigh costs and benefits. They choose the option that gives them the best outcome. They cannot imagine continuing to fight when the math says you have already lost. He paused, thinking, "We need to use this. Not just our weapons, our spirit. We need to make them understand that this war will never end. Not until one of our species is gone." The psychological warfare campaign began immediately. Resistance cells across the planet started leaving messages for Valari troops. The messages were written in the Valari language, which Dr. Minji and her team had decoded months ago. They were simple, direct, terrifying. "We do not stop. We do not negotiate. We do not forget. Every Valari soldier you send here will die here. Every ship in orbit will burn. Every one of you will learn what we have learned. There is no peace. There is no surrender. There is only war forever until one of us is extinct." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Valari soldiers began refusing deployment orders. Units reported equipment malfunctions that investigation revealed to be deliberate sabotage by their own crews. Morale collapsed. Soldiers who had conquered dozens of worlds without hesitation were now terrified of a species that had not even achieved faster than light travel. In orbit, Admiral Kethora watched his command disintegrate. He had been a soldier for over 600 years. He had seen empires rise and fall. He had witnessed species submit and species fight and species die. He had always believed in the collective's mission. Expansion was necessary. Conquest was natural. The strong took from the weak because that was how the universe worked. But this was different. This species did not fight like others. They did not hope for victory. They did not dream of survival. They fought because fighting was all they had left. They attacked because attack was the only response they knew. They died gladly, willingly, eagerly, as long as they could take Valari soldiers with them. It was not war. It was something else. Something Kethora had no word for. His second officer approached him on the command deck. She was young by Valari standards, only 200 years old. She had been selected for this mission because of her analytical skills. Now she looked as lost as everyone else. "Admiral," she said quietly, "we need to discuss withdrawal options." Kethora did not turn from the viewport. Below him, Earth hung in the darkness, its surface scarred with the marks of orbital bombardment. Fires still burned in a dozen places. Smoke clouds covered entire continents. "Withdrawal," he repeated. "We have never withdrawn from a conquest. Not in 12,000 years. We have never faced a species like this before," his officer replied. "Our behavioral models are useless. Our predictive algorithms return only errors. Our soldiers are dying at rates that will exhaust our expeditionary force within 2 standard years." She paused, gathering her courage. "Admiral, if we stay until this species stops fighting, we will lose 60% of our remaining forces. And based on current behavioral patterns, the AI cannot calculate when they will stop. There is no surrender threshold. There is no breaking point. They will fight until every single one of them is dead. Cathora closed his eyes. How long? Based on current casualty rates and human population estimates, complete planetary pacification would require approximately 40 standard years. Our losses during that period would exceed acceptable parameters by a factor of 7. 40 years. 40 years of war against enemies who could not be reasoned with, could not be frightened, could not be defeated in any meaningful sense because they had already accepted death. And if we leave? Cathora asked. We can complete resource extraction at current sites within 3 months. Then we withdraw all forces and establish a permanent quarantine around the system. Cathora thought about his career, his reputation, his legacy. He had never failed. He had never retreated. He had always won. But winning required an enemy who could lose. And humans, he was beginning to understand, had redefined what losing meant. To them, losing was not death. Losing was not destruction. Losing was submission. And they would rather burn their entire world than submit. He opened his eyes. Begin withdrawal preparations, he ordered. Priority extraction of processed resources. All ground forces to defensive positions around active mining sites. No offensive operations until evacuation is complete. His officers stared at him. Admiral, this will be the first withdrawal in collective history. The leadership will demand explanation. Then explain it to them, Cathora said. He turned away from the viewport. Tell them we encountered a species that cannot be conquered. A species that has no survival instinct. A species that treats death as victory if it can take enemies along. Tell them that fighting this species to extinction would cost more than any resource extraction could ever repay. He paused at the door to his quarters. And tell them to flag this system for permanent quarantine. No future contact authorized. No exceptions. He looked back one last time at the burning world below. We came here to harvest resources. We found something else. Something that does not fit into any model we have ever created. Call it rage. Call it madness. Call it whatever you want. His voice dropped to a whisper. I call it a warning. And I hope the collective is wise enough to listen. The withdrawal orders went out that night. Across Earth, resistance fighters watched as Valari forces began pulling back from outlying positions. They did not understand what was happening at first. They assumed it was a trap, a new strategy, a trick. But it was not a trick. The Valari were leaving, and humanity, bloody and broken and furious, had survived. The last Valari ship departed Earth orbit on March 17, 2149. Humanity watched it go from observation posts, scattered across the planet. From bunkers deep underground, from the ruins of cities that would never be rebuilt. Some people cheered. Some people wept. Most simply stood in silence, too exhausted and too broken to feel anything at all. They had won. The cost was beyond calculation. 2.7 billion humans had died during the occupation. That was more than a quarter of the species. 3 continents were rendered uninhabitable by orbital bombardment and radiation. The atmosphere was poisoned with ash and debris that would take decades to clear. The ocean currents had shifted. The climate had changed. The world that remained was scarred in ways that would never fully heal. But they had won. The Valari left behind something they had never created before in their 12,000 years of conquest. A warning beacon, broadcasting in every known language across the galaxy. The message was simple and absolute. Species designation: human, homeworld, Sol 3. Threat classification: absolute. Do not engage. Do not contact. Do not approach. General Doheen did not live to see the victory celebrations. He died 3 weeks after the last Valari ship departed in a small medical tent somewhere in the Australian outback. His body had been failing for months. He had simply refused to let it stop him until the war was over. Sergeant Soman was with him at the end. She held his hand as his breathing slowed, as his eyes grew dim, as the life faded from the man who had refused to surrender when surrender was the only logical choice. His last words were quiet, barely a whisper. "Tell them we held. Tell them we did not break." Soman nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I will tell them, sir. I will tell everyone." Captain Jiwan became one of the architects of the new Earth Defense Force. She was 41 years old now, and her body bore the marks of years of war. Her left arm had been replaced with a mechanical prosthetic. She walked with a permanent limp from injuries that had never properly healed. Her face was lined with scars, both visible and invisible. But her eyes still burned with the same fire that had kept her fighting through the darkest days. And she spent the next 40 years ensuring that humanity would never be caught unprepared again. Dr. Minji led the effort to reverse engineer captured Valari technology. It was slow, painstaking work. The alien systems were centuries ahead of anything humans had developed. But Minji was patient, and she had inherited the stubbornness that had won the war. Within 20 years, humanity had achieved faster than light travel. Within 30, they had established their first colony beyond the Sol system. Within 50, they had built a fleet capable of defending not just Earth, but every world humans had settled. Major Taeyang, still in his wheelchair, still commanding, gave the speech at the first Memorial Day for the burning. It was a new holiday, established to honor those who had died during the occupation. It would be observed every year forever, until humanity itself ceased to exist. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered to hear him speak. They stood in the shadow of the memorial wall, a massive structure that stretched for kilometers, covered with the names of every human who had died in the war. There were too many names to read, too many lives to count, too much grief to ever fully process. Taeyang looked out at the crowd. He saw survivors. Every person there had lost someone. Every person there carried scars. Every person there remembered what it felt like to watch the sky turn to fire. "They came here expecting us to calculate," he said. His voice carried across the silent crowd. "To weigh costs against benefits. To choose survival over resistance." They had conquered 300 species using that logic. They believed it was universal. They believed that all intelligent life would eventually bow to superior force. He paused, looking at the names on the wall behind him. But they did not understand something fundamental about humans. When you hurt us enough, we stop counting. When you take everything from us, we stop caring about tomorrow. When you leave us nothing to lose. He smiled, and it was not a kind smile. We become the thing that empires have nightmares about. The crowd was silent. Some were crying. Some were nodding. All of them understood. 50 years later, humanity encountered their second alien species. They were called the Vantari, a peaceful federation of traders who had heard the Valari warning and approached Earth with extreme caution. Their ships stayed well outside the solar system. Their communications were polite to the point of nervousness. They had clearly spent a long time debating whether to make contact at all. Ambassador Jisoo met them aboard a neutral station at the edge of human space. She was the granddaughter of Yin-hee, the old woman who had died leading a charge against a Valari patrol station in Tokyo, a bottle of fire in each hand. Jisoo had grown up hearing stories about her grandmother. She had learned to walk among the monuments to the dead. She carried the history of her species like a weight on her shoulders. The Vantari ambassador was a tall, thin being with skin that shifted colors based on emotion. Currently, he was a pale shade of yellow, which Jisoo had learned indicated nervousness. "We have studied your species extensively. the Ventari said. We have reviewed the Valari records. We have analyzed your behavior during the occupation. He paused. We have one question that we cannot answer. One question that has been debated across 1,000 worlds. Jisoo nodded. Ask, why did you not surrender? The mathematics were clear. You could not win. You could not even survive as a civilization. Every rational analysis showed that resistance was futile. And yet you resisted anyway. Why? Jisoo was quiet for a long moment. She thought about her grandmother, burning to death 17 meters from an alien fortress. She thought about the names on the memorial wall, stretching on forever. She thought about the stories she had grown up with, the scars that marked every human old enough to remember. You are right, she said finally. We could not win, but we could make losing cost them. And sometimes that is enough. Sometimes making the enemy bleed, even when you know you will bleed more, is the only victory available. She met the Ventari ambassador's eyes. Humans will always take that victory, every single time, because the alternative is submission. And we do not submit. We do not surrender. We do not forgive. She leaned forward. And we never, ever forget. The Ventari ambassador stared at her for a long moment. His skin had shifted to a deep blue, which Jisoo knew indicated deep thought. We wish to establish trade relations, he said slowly. We believe our peoples could benefit from peaceful exchange. Jisoo nodded. We would welcome that. Humanity has no desire for conflict. We simply wish to live in peace, to explore the universe, to learn and grow alongside other species. She paused. But we should be clear about one thing. Yes? If anyone threatens us again, if anyone tries to take what is ours, if anyone believes they can calculate us into submission. She smiled, and it was her grandmother's smile, fierce and unafraid. They will learn the same lesson the Valari learned. And it will be the last lesson they ever learn. The Trade Federation signed the most favorable treaty in their history that day. They had calculated all the outcomes. They had weighed all the options. They had made the rational choice. And the rational choice was to never, ever make humanity angry. Across the galaxy, the warning beacon continued to broadcast. Species read it and changed their routes. Empires studied it and adjusted their expansion plans. Conquerors heard it and looked for easier targets. Threat classification. Absolute. Do not engage. Do not contact. Do not approach. And on Earth, in the shadow of the memorial wall, under skies that had finally cleared after decades of ash, humans continued to live. They built and loved and fought and dreamed. They explored new worlds and made new mistakes and learned new lessons. But they never forgot the fire that had forged them. They never forgot the price of their survival. And carved into the base of every monument, written into the opening lines of every history book, taught to every child before they learned to walk, was a single phrase. We do not kneel. Not to gods. Not to empires. Not to mathematics. Not to any force in the universe. We are human, and we will rage until the stars themselves burn out.